My name is Paige. I am 30 years old and I work as a supply chain data analyst in Chicago. My life is built on tracking variables, predicting outcomes, and ruthlessly eliminating inefficiencies. When my father suddenly passed away, leaving behind a $15 million logistics empire, my stepmother assumed I would be an easy target. She thought my silence was weakness. She thought I would roll over when she stole everything my father spent his life building. She had no idea I was already running the numbers on her downfall. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled her life and exposed her secrets, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who severely underestimated your intelligence. Growing up, my father, Thomas, was the center of my universe. He built Apex Freight from a single rusty delivery truck into a regional powerhouse, working grueling 80-hour weeks to ensure my younger sister Gwen and I never wanted for anything. He was inherently practical, deeply grounded, and fiercely protective of his daughters. Then came Sylvia. She married him when I was 20, sweeping into our quiet lives with her designer handbags and relentless country club aspirations. She brought along her two entitled children, Preston and Kendall, who immediately treated our family wealth like their personal checking account. For a decade, I watched helplessly as Sylvia isolated my father, replacing his genuine lifelong friends with her shallow status, obsessed socialite circle. When his heart gave out without warning just days ago, the core foundation of my universe cracked. But Sylvia did not wait for the dirt on his grave to settle before initiating her hostile takeover. She moved with predatory swiftness. The reality of my terrifying nightmare began less than 48 hours after the funeral service concluded. I stood on the sweeping driveway of my father's $5 million estate, the freezing, relentless Chicago rain soaking straight through my black mourning dress. The heavy oak front doors violently flew open, and my stepbrother Preston stood proudly on the threshold. He wore a smug, deeply self-satisfied grin that made my stomach churn. With a careless flick of his wrists, he hurled my heavy leather suitcase down the steep stone steps. It hit the wet pavement with a sickening thud, the zipper bursting open upon impact and spilling my carefully folded clothes directly into the muddy puddles. Seconds later, Gwen's luggage followed crashing onto the concrete. Gwen stood right beside me, her body shaking with violent sobs, completely shattered by the devastating loss of our father and the sheer cruelty of this unexpected moment. Then Sylvia stepped out onto the wide, covered porch, remaining entirely untouched by the pouring rain. She looked immaculate, wearing her brand-new widowhood like a high-fashion editorial spread, complete with an expensive black cashmere wrap. Kendall flanked her right side, perfectly mirroring her mother's icy expression. Sylvia looked down at us, as if we were filthy trespassers who had accidentally wandered onto her manicured lawn. She announced with a chillingly steady voice that the house was now exclusively hers, claiming that she was simply cleaning out the unnecessary clutter. She stated that since we were fully grown adults, it was time we learned how the real harsh world worked without my father's money to shield us. The audacity of her words was paralyzing. My father's familiar scent still lingered heavily in the hallways of that house, yet Sylvia was already purging his biological daughters like unwanted inventory. Beside me, Gwen's husband DeAndre immediately stepped forward. DeAndre is a brilliantly talented architect, a proud black man who has always carried himself with quiet dignity, immense grace, and unshakable strength. He had been our absolute rock over the past 2 agonizing days, physically holding Gwen together when she threatened to fall apart completely. Seeing the unadulterated malice on Sylvia's face, he moved to shield us from her verbal assault, raising his strong voice to point out the moral depravity of forcing grieving children out into a dangerous storm. He demanded that Sylvia show a single shred of basic human decency, reminding her forcefully that this was still our childhood home, and that official legal proceedings regarding the massive estate had not even begun to take place. Sylvia did not raise her voice in response. She simply looked DeAndre up and down, her cold eyes traveling slowly from his soaked work boots to his rain-slicked face, her perfectly painted lips curling into a sneer of pure aristocratic disgust. She delivered a thinly veiled, deeply poisonous remark about his background. She suggested maliciously that someone from his demographic and urban neighborhood should be perfectly accustomed to living on handouts, and that he had obviously only married into this wealthy family to secure a comfortable lifestyle he could never possibly achieve on his own merits. She told him to take his weeping wife and go back to the daily struggles of his kind. The racial hostility and classist venom dripping from her carefully chosen words were unmistakable. It was a calculated strike deliberately designed to humiliate him deeply and provoke an explosive physical reaction. DeAndre's jaw clenched so tight I could actually hear his teeth grind together. Every single muscle in his strong body tensed, his fierce protective instincts warring violently with his profound, justified outrage. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward the porch, fully prepared to risk absolutely everything to defend our honor and demand the basic respect we were owed. But I could not let him give Sylvia the satisfaction of a chaotic, screaming match. I knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted a messy scene. She wanted the wealthy neighbors to look out their expensive windows and see the hysterical stepchildren causing a frightening disturbance. She desperately wanted a valid reason to call the police and paint herself as the terrified, helpless widow under attack. I reached out and placed a firm, steadying hand flat against DeAndre's chest. I did not say a single word, but the intense pressure of my palm communicated everything we needed. I met his furious, burning gaze, silently begging him to hold back, promising him with my eyes that this was absolutely not the end of the war. He let out a ragged breath, the tension slowly draining from his broad shoulders as he understood my silent plea. Without sparing another glance at the porch, I turned my back on Sylvia Preston and Kendall forever. I knelt right down in the freezing puddles, methodically gathering my soaked clothes and forcing them back into the broken suitcase. DeAndre silently helped Gwen to the passenger side of his car, gently shielding her from the heavy downpour while I hauled the waterlogged luggage into the trunk, my hands completely numb from the biting cold. The car doors slammed shut, sealing us inside a heavy, suffocating silence. As DeAndre started the engine and pulled away from the wrought iron gates of my childhood home, I stared out the rain-streaked window. Gwen continued to weep softly in the front seat, her heartbreak echoing painfully in the confined space. But as I watched the grand, imposing estate disappear completely in the rearview mirror, my own tears completely and permanently stopped. The overwhelming, paralyzing grief that had violently gripped me since the moment the hospital called to announce my father's sudden death suddenly evaporated. In its place, a freezing surgical clarity settled permanently over my mind. As a dedicated data analyst, I have been extensively trained to strip away all distracting emotion and focus entirely on the underlying architecture of any given problem. Sitting in the back of that car, shivering uncontrollably in my damp mourning clothes, I stopped actively mourning my father and started meticulously examining the variables of Sylvia's erratic behavior. Her urgency to kick us out was not just simple maliciousness, it was a highly strategic maneuver. She was moving much too fast, acting with a level of wild desperation that clearly indicated she was trying to secure the perimeter before we could look too closely at the massive estate. My father was a meticulous, calculating man who built a logistics empire by always being at least 3 steps ahead of his toughest competitors. He definitely knew Sylvia was greedy, and he certainly knew exactly how deeply she resented Gwen and me. There was absolutely no statistical probability that Thomas would leave his daughters entirely unprotected to the cruel whims of a woman he had grown increasingly distant from over the last 2 challenging years. The rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers sounded exactly like a ticking clock counting down. Sylvia genuinely thought she had decisively won the game by aggressively clearing the board before the pieces were even fully set. She foolishly believed that stripping us of our immediate comfort and security would completely blind us to the bigger picture. She was heavily banking on my fresh grief to make me incredibly weak, highly compliant, and totally desperate. But she had fundamentally and catastrophically miscalculated my true nature. I did not want the enormous house. I did not care at all about the designer furniture, the luxury cars, or the exclusive country club memberships. I cared strictly about the hard data, the hidden corporate structures, and the silent paper trails that my brilliant father inevitably left behind. Sylvia had successfully thrown me out into the freezing cold, but in doing so, she had accidentally activated a completely different, highly dangerous version of me. The mourning, heartbroken daughter was officially gone. The cold, calculating analyst had fully taken over, and I was going to dissect her newly stolen empire line by line and number by number until there was absolutely nothing left for her to hold on to. Exactly 7 days after the rain-soaked eviction from my childhood home, I found myself sitting in the suffocatingly plush mahogany-lined conference room of my father's longtime estate attorney. The air conditioning hummed a low, sterile note that did nothing to cut the thick tension suffocating the room. I sat perfectly still, my posture straight, and my expression carefully blank. Across the expansive glass table sat Sylvia, wearing a tailored navy suit that screamed new money and smelled faintly of victory. She had flanked herself with her two children, Preston and Kendall, who both looked like they were waiting for a highly anticipated theatrical performance to begin. To Sylvia's immediate right sat her hired gun, a slick, predatory corporate lawyer named Loxley, whose expensive gold watch gleamed offensively under the harsh recessed lighting. Beside me sat Mr. Caldwell, my father's most trusted confidant and legal counsel for over 2 decades. He looked utterly exhausted, the deep lines around his eyes, betraying countless sleepless nights spent poring over decades of complex logistical contracts and estate documents, desperately trying to find a way to protect my sister and me from the impending slaughter. The meeting began without basic pleasantries or even a momentary acknowledgement of my recent loss. Loxley leaned forward, interlacing his perfectly manicured fingers, and dropped the financial guillotine Sylvia had been sharpening since the morning of the funeral. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the smooth glass surface towards Caldwell. Inside was my father's original prenuptial agreement, but heavily annotated with bright red flags, marking a buried, highly obscure termination clause. Loxley explained with a sickeningly smooth, practiced cadence that due to a specific convoluted structural change my father had made to the corporate holding entity of Apex Freight 3 years ago, the original asset protection boundaries had essentially vanished. Sylvia was not just claiming the $5 million mansion she had already violently thrown us out of. She was aggressively exploiting this legal loophole to claim absolute, unmitigated ownership of the entire $15 million logistics empire, leaving 0 percentages, 0 voting rights, and 0 financial dividends for either Gwen or me. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking to behold. Apex Freight was not just a company, it was the physical manifestation of my father's sweat, his brilliant logistical mind, and his unwavering dedication to our future. Sylvia was attempting to swallow it whole, digesting my father's legacy solely to fund her endless country club lifestyle and bankroll her children's extravagant habits. Caldwell absolutely erupted. The normally composed, soft-spoken attorney slammed his open palm violently against the table, rattling the expensive crystal water glasses and causing Loxley to jump back in his seat. Caldwell pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Loxley, accusing him of bad faith interpretations, legal extortion, and a profound lack of basic human decency. Caldwell turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound grief and desperate urgency. He begged me to let him file an immediate injunction in probate court to freeze the accounts. He passionately detailed exactly how we could drag this dispute through the legal system for years, tying up the assets securely and preventing Sylvia from touching a single dime of the company's operating capital. He warned me, his voice cracking with genuine emotion, that if we let Sylvia take the helm, she would mercilessly bleed Apex Freight dry within a matter of months. She would immediately liquidate the heavy machinery, sell off the prime real estate warehouses to the highest bidder, and completely destroy the livelihoods of the hundreds of loyal truck drivers and warehouse workers my father had always considered his extended family. Caldwell pleaded with me to fight back, promising he would work the entire case pro bono, pouring every ounce of his extensive legal expertise into completely destroying Sylvia's greedy, fraudulent claim. Before I could even process Caldwell's impassioned plea, Preston leaned back in his leather ergonomic chair and let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed loudly in the tense room. He looked at me with undisguised pity, casually adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer shirt. He mockingly reminded the room that extended legal battles required massive amounts of upfront capital that a mere supply chain data analyst like myself could never possibly scrape together on my modest salary. Kendall immediately chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, as she suggested I should probably focus on keeping my little spreadsheet job rather than playing corporate warfare with the big dogs. She then proudly announced, flipping her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder, that Sylvia had already promised her the position of Vice President of Public Relations at Apex Freight, despite her having absolutely zero experience in the logistics industry. Preston smirked, adding that he was slated to become the new Chief Operating Officer, a title that came with a corner office, a company-funded luxury vehicle, and an absurdly inflated six-figure salary he intended to use to fund his constant partying. They were openly gloating, actively reveling in the fact that they were completely unqualified parasites about to gorge themselves on the healthy, profitable host my father had painstakingly built from the ground up. They looked at me, expecting immediate tears, expecting outrage, expecting the desperate, pathetic pleading of a defeated daughter watching her rightful inheritance be stolen by opportunistic strangers. I let their cruel laughter echo in the silent room for a few long, agonizing seconds. I did not blink. I did not frown. I simply observed them, my mind rapidly compiling the variables, assessing their staggering arrogance, and calculating the exact trajectory of their impending ruin. I slowly turned my gaze from the gloating stepchildren to Sylvia. She was watching me like a hawk, her eyes glittering with predatory triumph, silently daring me to initiate a messy, expensive war. She was entirely confident she could win. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass table, and looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes. I let a small, chillingly placid smile touch the corners of my mouth and delivered the words that would ultimately seal her absolute fate. "Fine," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotional weight. "Give her everything." The entire room froze in utter disbelief. Caldwell physically recoiled, staring at me as if I had suddenly begun speaking in tongues. Loxley's smug smile faltered, replaced by a look of profound, deeply unsettled confusion. Preston and Kendall stopped laughing instantly, their triumphant expressions collapsing into blank incomprehension. Sylvia narrowed her eyes suspiciously, searching my face for the trick, the hidden trap, the hysterical breakdown she had been so eagerly anticipating. Caldwell grabbed my arm tightly, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper, reminding me that I was voluntarily walking away from a $15 million logistics empire and a massive estate without a single fight. I ignored him entirely, keeping my gaze locked fiercely onto my stepmother. I reiterated my stance clearly, officially waiving my rights to contest the interpretation of the prenuptial agreement. I told Sylvia she could have the sprawling mansion, the massive fleet of delivery trucks, the regional distribution warehouses, and every single cent currently resting in the corporate operating accounts. I surrender it all unconditionally. I had only one single, non-negotiable demand before I signed the paperwork. I wanted the heavy, battered, severely rusted steel safe that sat tucked away in the darkest corner of my father's private home office. Sylvia stared at me for a long, tense moment, her mind clearly racing to carefully evaluate the monetary value of my bizarre request. She knew that safe intimately. She had loudly complained about it for years, repeatedly calling it an ugly, outdated eyesore that ruined the modern aesthetic of her expensive home decor. She knew it held no stacks of cash, no valuable bearer bonds, no expensive jewelry, and absolutely no hidden gold. To her narrow, money-obsessed mind, it was nothing more than a heavy metal box filled with worthless, sentimental junk, old faded photographs, useless expired contracts, and nostalgic trinkets from the early days of building his business. A greedy, triumphant smile slowly spread across her face as she mentally finalized the transaction, convinced she had just pulled off the heist of a lifetime. She eagerly granted my demand without a second thought, instantly signing the binding legal paperwork that handed her the keys to my father's entire kingdom, completely unaware that she had just willingly handed me the absolute weapon of her own destruction. The satisfaction radiating from her posture was almost intoxicating to witness. She truly believed that she had flawlessly outmaneuvered me, eliminating the final obstacle to her unearned fortune. As I reached out and took the freshly signed document back across the table, I knew the real game was only just beginning. I carefully folded the paper and slipped it securely into my pocket, feeling the cold weight of my impending vengeance. The heavy rusted steel safe sat securely in the trunk of my car as I drove to the Apex Freight headquarters the following morning. I walked into the bustling open-plan office exactly at 8 o'clock, logging into my workstation, as if the corporate earthquake had never happened. My dual monitors flickered to life, displaying the complex supply chain algorithms I had spent years mastering. The familiar hum of the operations floor usually brought me comfort. But today, the atmosphere felt incredibly fragile, thick with unspoken rumors. At exactly 10 in the morning, the main elevator doors parted with a sharp chime that silenced the entire floor. Sylvia stepped out. She wore a tailored crimson dress suit that demanded absolute attention, flanked closely by her son Preston and the ever-present lawyer Loxley. Preston wore a bespoke suit that looked entirely unearned, surveying the hard-working employees like a feudal lord inspecting his newly acquired peasants. Sylvia did not call me into the private glass-walled human resources office for a discreet conversation. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted blood. Her high heels clicked rhythmically against the polished concrete floor as she marched directly toward the center of the analytics department. Dozens of employees, people I had worked alongside for years, stopped typing and stared. Sylvia stopped right behind my chair. I slowly turned around, meeting her triumphant gaze. With a voice modulated to carry across the vast room, she announced that Apex Freight was undergoing immediate corporate restructuring. She declared that the company could no longer justify the bloated salary of a redundant data analyst, particularly one whose continued presence might cause unnecessary workplace friction under the new ownership. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. "You are terminated effective immediately," she projected loudly, ensuring every single cubicle heard her. Preston smirked, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Security will provide you with a cardboard box." Sylvia continued, her voice dripping with artificial corporate regret. "You have exactly 10 minutes to clear your personal belongings and vacate my building." The profound silence in the room was deafening. My colleagues looked down at their keyboards, entirely too terrified for their own livelihoods to speak up. I did not give Sylvia the satisfaction of a reaction. I calmly locked my computer terminal, placed my few personal items into the provided box, and walked out of the building with my head held high, the heavy doors of my father's empire closing firmly behind me. The loss of my job was a calculated variable I had already fully anticipated. I knew Sylvia would sever my professional tie to the company the second she secured legal control. What I had not anticipated was the breathtaking speed and sheer malice of her secondary strike. 2 days later, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from Gwen. The moment I answered, the agonizing sound of my younger sister's uncontrollable sobbing flooded through the speaker. Her breaths came in sharp, jagged gasps, her voice breaking so violently I could barely understand her frantic words. I rushed out of my modest suburban apartment and drove straight to her house. When I pushed through their front door, I found Gwen curled into a tight ball on the living room sofa, clutching a thick stack of medical paperwork against her chest. DeAndre paced the length of the hardwood floor like a caged lion, his hands running anxiously over his face, his jaw tight with an explosive, helpless fury. The devastating truth spilled out between Gwen's shattered tears. For 3 years, my sister and DeAndre had fought an exhausting battle against severe infertility. They had poured their hearts and savings into the grueling process. Just 2 weeks prior, under my father's watchful and supportive eye, they had finally begun a highly specialized, incredibly expensive round of in vitro fertilization. My father had deliberately structured the executive health insurance plan at Apex Freight to fully cover the astronomical costs of these specific fertility treatments, wanting nothing more than to see his youngest daughter become a mother. But that morning, the fertility clinic had called Gwen with catastrophic news. Their upcoming embryo transfer, scheduled for the very next day, was abruptly canceled. Sylvia, wielding her new absolute authority as majority owner, had specifically and maliciously ordered human resources to terminate Gwen and DeAndre's corporate health insurance coverage, effective retroactively to the date of my father's death. The clinic demanded a direct out-of-pocket payment of $40,000 by the end of the business day to proceed with the time-sensitive medical cycle. Without the insurance and without the immediate cash, Gwen's final, desperate hope for a child was being unceremoniously destroyed. Sylvia had known exactly what she was doing. It was a targeted surgical strike aimed directly at the most vulnerable, painful part of my sister's life. She wanted to eradicate every remaining trace of our happiness, punishing us simply for existing. Seeing his wife completely broken, DeAndre's profound protective instincts had pushed him to the absolute brink. Spread across the kitchen island were documents he had hastily printed out just before my arrival. I walked over and examined the pages, my blood running cold. They were predatory loan applications. DeAndre, a brilliant architect who usually calculated every single variable with extreme precision, was blindly preparing to sign his name to a massive personal loan with an astronomical, financially ruinous interest rate. He was willing to leverage his entire future, willing to drown them both in decades of inescapable crippling debt, just to save this one fleeting chance at giving Gwen the family she so desperately wanted. I moved toward the kitchen island with quiet, absolute authority. DeAndre had a pen gripped tightly in his hand, his knuckles white as he leaned over the dotted line. I reached out and clamped my hand firmly over his wrist. He looked up at me, his dark eyes swirling with a mixture of profound exhaustion, fierce pride, and deep devastation. He told me, his voice thick with unshed emotion, that he had to do this. He said he could not stand by and watch Sylvia steal Gwen's future, that he would work 3 jobs to pay off the exorbitant interest. He was trying so desperately to be the steadfast shield my sister needed, willing to sacrifice his own financial survival to block Sylvia's cruelty. I gently but forcefully pried the pen from his rigid fingers. I looked him dead in the eye, channeling all the cold, calculating focus that I had been honing since the moment we were thrown out into the rain. I told him he was not going to sign those predatory papers. I told him that taking on catastrophic debt was exactly the kind of desperate, unforced error Sylvia was banking on us making. She wanted us broke, panicked, and permanently subjugated to her whims. I turned to look at Gwen, who had raised her tear-stained face from the sofa cushions, searching mine for any glimmer of hope. I promised them both with a quiet intensity that left absolutely no room for doubt that I would fix this. I asked them to trust me, to give me just a little bit of time, and to hold off on making any permanent financial decisions today. I assured them that Sylvia's perceived victory was built on a fragile house of cards, and that the medical bills would be paid without surrendering a single inch of their future. DeAndre searched my face for a long, tense moment. He knew my analytical mind. He knew I never made a promise unless I had already calculated the exact mathematical probability of delivering on it. Slowly, the rigid tension in his broad shoulders eased. He stepped back from the kitchen island, leaving the loan documents unsigned on the cool marble counter. He walked over to the sofa and pulled Gwen tightly into his arms, holding her securely, while she wept against his shoulder. I left their home with a renewed, icy determination pumping fiercely through my veins. The stakes had officially escalated from a simple corporate takeover to a deeply personal war of attrition. Sylvia had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and her actions demanded total devastation. I drove back to my suburban apartment, my mind racing through complex algorithmic possibilities and strategic countermoves. When I walked through my front door, the heavy rusted steel safe I had claimed for my father's office sat waiting for me on the living room floor. Sylvia had foolishly granted it to me, entirely convinced it contained nothing more than worthless sentimental junk. She had gravely underestimated the brilliant man she married, and she had certainly underestimated his daughter. I knelt on the carpet, running my fingertips over the cold, battered metal surface. The time for mourning had officially ended. It was time to unlock the secrets hidden inside the heavy steel walls and destroy my stepmother forever. My apartment was a sharp contrast to the sprawling $5 million estate Sylvia had aggressively claimed as her own. It was a modest, functional space on the second floor of a quiet, suburban building, characterized by clean lines and minimal clutter. The heavy rusted steel safe now sat squat and imposing in the center of my living room rug. I stared at the combination dial, a heavy brass mechanism that felt entirely out of place in the modern digital age. Sylvia had eagerly surrendered this metal box, convinced it contained nothing but worthless nostalgia. She lacked the capacity to understand the brilliant mind of the man she had married. My father never kept sentimental items under heavy lock and key. He believed memories belonged in photographs on the mantel, not buried in the dark. If he locked something away, it possessed strategic value, requiring absolute protection. I knelt on the thick carpet, resting my fingertips against the cold brass dial. The combination was not a birthday, an anniversary, or a childhood address. It was a sequence of product identification codes from the very first major commercial freight shipment his company ever delivered. It was a massive milestone he made me memorize when I was a teenager, just learning the initial ropes of his business operations. I spun the dial with practiced precision. Right to 47, left twice to 12, right to 89. A heavy, satisfying mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. I pulled the heavy handle down, and the thick steel door swung open with a harsh metallic groan that sent a shiver down my spine. I reached inside the dark velvet-lined interior, my pulse quickening with anticipation. There were no stacks of crisp $100 bills banded together. There were no hidden stock certificates, no secret property deeds, and absolutely no nostalgic family photo albums collecting dust. The cavernous space was completely empty, except for two incredibly small items resting squarely in the center of the bottom shelf. The first was a heavy matte black USB drive encased in a rugged, military-grade titanium shell designed to withstand extreme physical damage and severe tampering. The second was a single yellowed sheet of paper. I carefully lifted the paper into the light. It was an old logistics manifest dated nearly a decade ago, detailing a routine shipment of industrial manufacturing equipment. I flipped the fragile parchment over. Written across the back of the page in my father's distinct handwriting was a cryptic string of exactly 64 alphanumeric characters. This was not garbage. This was a highly sophisticated digital lockbox, and the string of characters was the cryptographic key. I carried the titanium drive and the faded manifest to my home office setup. As a senior supply chain data analyst, my workspace was built for processing complex datasets. 3 high-resolution monitors dominated the wide desk, connected to a processing tower boasting immense computational power. I plugged the heavy black drive into a secure, isolated port. Immediately, a stark black command prompt flashed across my screen, demanding a decryption key. The drive was protected by advanced enterprise-level encryption algorithms, typically reserved for highly classified corporate trade secrets. Anyone lacking the precise cryptographic seed would find the drive permanently inaccessible, automatically wiping its contents after a handful of failed attempts. I did not hesitate. I carefully typed the 64 characters exactly as my father had written them, double-checking every single letter and digit against his familiar scrawl. I hit the enter key. A tense silence settled over the room as my processing tower's cooling fans whined, kicking into high gear to parse the complex decryption protocol. For 3 long minutes, the screen remained an impenetrable void. Then a cascade of green text began scrolling rapidly down the monitors. The military-grade encryption cracked, unfurling a massive, meticulously organized digital archive. I leaned forward, the glow of the monitors reflecting in my eyes as I began to navigate the sprawling directory of hidden folders and compressed databases. I worked through the entire night, fueled by black coffee and a relentless, icy determination to uncover the exact truth my father had died protecting. The sheer volume of data was staggering, consisting of gigabytes of archived emails, private server logs, internal financial audits, and hundreds of recorded phone transcripts. My specialized professional background in data analytics allowed me to swiftly write custom sorting scripts in Python, filtering the massive information dump to isolate behavioral anomalies, irregular communication patterns, and hidden financial discrepancies. Around 3 in the morning, the complex digital puzzle pieces finally began locking together into a horrifying, crystal-clear picture of profound deception. I opened a deeply buried, password-protected folder ominously labeled Internal Parasites. Inside were detailed dossiers my father had compiled over the past 24 months. The first shocking revelation was a collection of intercepted text messages, hotel receipts, and private emails that undeniably confirmed a long-standing, highly explicit romantic affair between Sylvia and Trent, the chief financial officer of Apex Freight. The messages were sickeningly bold, filled with arrogant boasts about how easily they were manipulating my aging father, and crude jokes about his steadily declining physical health. Sylvia had not just been an opportunistic stepmother, she had been actively betraying my father under his own roof, utilizing his own executive as her willing accomplice. But the infidelity was merely the superficial layer of a much deeper, far more destructive conspiracy. I ran a cross-referencing algorithm comparing Trent's official corporate financial reports against the raw, unfiltered server logs my father had secretly captured. The resulting data visualization painted a terrifying portrait of systemic, calculated corporate theft. For 2 solid years, Trent and Sylvia had been slowly, methodically bleeding Apex Freight dry. They had established a complex web of offshore shell companies and phantom logistics vendors. Trent used his absolute authority as CFO to approve hundreds of inflated invoices and authorize payments for imaginary freight routes, funneling millions of dollars directly into untraceable private accounts controlled by Sylvia. They had been extraordinarily careful, siphoning the funds in increments just small enough to avoid triggering automated banking alerts or arousing the suspicion of the external auditing firm. They believed their embezzlement scheme was entirely foolproof, a flawless financial crime executed perfectly in the shadows where no one would ever look. But my father was a man who built his entire empire on tracking every single cent, every drop of fuel, and every mile driven. He had noticed the subtle financial bleeding almost immediately. The digital archive unequivocally proved that he had tracked every stolen dollar, identified every fake offshore vendor, and completely mapped out their illicit network from top to bottom. The devastating question burned fiercely in my mind. If my father had acquired this absolute, undeniable proof of their affair and their massive financial crimes, why had he never confronted them? Why had he not fired Trent? Filed for an immediate punitive divorce from Sylvia, and handed this mountain of evidence over to the federal authorities, I dug deeper into the final set of encrypted folders, desperately searching for the logic behind his silence. As the first rays of morning sunlight began to filter through my apartment blinds, casting pale shadows across my desk, I finally found the answer. My father had not confronted them because confronting them would have only resulted in a messy, highly publicized legal battle. A standard divorce and a public corporate scandal would have severely damaged the reputation of Apex Freight, potentially causing panicked investors to pull their funding and loyal clients to flee. He loved his company and his employees far too much to drag them through a destructive, prolonged media circus. Instead of initiating a loud war, he had chosen to build a silent, inescapable trap. The financial breadcrumbs he left behind indicated a brilliant, ruthless countermeasure that he had been carefully preparing in the background, far away from Trent's prying eyes. He had allowed them to continue stealing, allowing them to grow arrogant and comfortable in their deception, gathering an insurmountable mountain of criminal evidence while he secretly restructured his logistics empire. He was waiting for the perfect, most devastating moment to spring the trap, a moment that would legally annihilate them while completely shielding the company from the fallout. His sudden heart attack had interrupted the final execution of his master plan, leaving the trap fully armed but untriggered. Sylvia and Trent genuinely believed they had won. They thought his death was their ultimate victory, completely unaware that he had archived every single one of their sins onto this titanium drive. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, my muscles aching from hours of intense focus, but my mind felt sharper and more dangerous than it ever had. I stared at the irrefutable evidence illuminating my screens, the undeniable proof of their greed, their betrayal, and their impending doom. I gently unplugged the heavy titanium drive from my desktop computer, feeling its solid weight resting firmly in the palm of my hand. Sylvia had viciously thrown me out of my childhood home into the freezing rain, thinking she was discarding a weak opponent. She had blindly handed me this rusted steel safe, completely convinced it contained absolutely nothing of true value. She had no idea she handed me the fully loaded weapon my brilliant father had meticulously forged. I closed my eyes, letting the profound magnitude of my discovery settle into my bones. The board was perfectly set, the evidence was absolute, and the executioner was finally ready to strike. The heavy titanium drive rested in my palm for a moment before I plugged it back into my processing tower. Finding the irrefutable evidence of Sylvia and Trent embezzling millions was satisfying, but it was merely the diagnostic phase of my father's ultimate failsafe. I knew Thomas Wilson better than anyone. He was a master of logistics, building his empire on routing efficiency and mitigating risk. He would never document his own destruction and leave it to the slow grind of the criminal justice system. The evidence of fraud was the bait, but I needed to find the steel teeth of the trap. I cracked my knuckles, took a sip of cold coffee, and initiated a secondary scan of the decrypted server logs, targeting anomalous legal filings and intellectual property registries rather than raw financial transactions. To the outside observer, and certainly to a shallow socialite like Sylvia, the massive wealth of Apex Freight appeared to reside strictly in its physical assets. She looked at the company and saw hundreds of 18-wheeler trucks rumbling across the interstates. She saw distribution warehouses situated on prime real estate outside major Midwestern cities. She saw a massive fleet of forklifts, a towering corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago, and a staggering payroll of personnel. She genuinely believed whoever controlled the keys to those buildings controlled the kingdom. But as a data analyst, I knew the physical assets were nothing but expensive, depreciating liabilities without the actual brain that controlled them. The true staggering value of Apex Freight was completely invisible. It was the proprietary supply chain optimization algorithm that my father had personally developed a decade ago and continually refined. It was a brilliantly complex piece of routing software that dynamically calculated weather patterns, traffic congestion, fuel prices, and weight distribution in real time. That algorithm allowed Apex Freight to consistently undercut competitors on delivery times while maximizing fuel efficiency, generating the massive profit margins that funded Sylvia's lavish lifestyle. Without that software, the company was just a disorganized collection of expensive metal boxes driving blindly across the country. I navigated through a nested directory labeled Archival Architecture and opened a heavily guarded folder containing corporate legal documents. My eyes scanned the illuminated screens, absorbing the dense legalese with growing astonishment. 3 years ago, right around the exact time my father's private server logs first began detecting Trent's fraudulent offshore financial transfers, Thomas had quietly initiated a monumental corporate restructuring. He had hired a specialized intellectual property attorney, entirely outside of the company's own normal legal network. Through a series of brilliant, perfectly legal, and deeply complex maneuvers, my father had systematically extracted the source code and the total ownership rights of the optimization algorithm completely out of the Apex Freight corporate umbrella. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the final series of portable document format files. My father had established a separate, entirely anonymous, limited liability company based out of Delaware. Delaware corporate law offers unparalleled privacy protections, ensuring that the true owners of an entity can remain entirely hidden from public records and corporate audits. He named this shadow entity Sentinel Logistics Solutions. He then executed a flawless, irrevocable transfer of 100% of the algorithm's intellectual property rights directly into Sentinel's absolute control. Apex Freight no longer owned the brain that made it profitable. It had not owned it for many years. I clicked open the operating agreement for Sentinel Logistics Solutions, my heart pounding a fierce, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I scrolled rapidly down to the beneficiary and ownership declarations, fully expecting to see my father's name listed as the sole proprietor. Instead, the bold black text on the glowing screen brought tears to my eyes. Not of grief, but of profound, overwhelming awe. The anonymous corporate entity was registered entirely under my name. My social security number, my digital signature securely executed through a blind trust that automatically dissolved and granted me total executive control the very second my father's death certificate was officially filed. My father had not left me unprotected. He had silently handed me the absolute master key to his entire life's work, shielding it securely in the dark where Sylvia's greedy hands could never possibly reach it at any single time. But the absolute genius of his trap did not stop at simply protecting the intellectual property. I opened the final document in the encrypted folder, a master licensing agreement drawn up between Sentinel Logistics Solutions and Apex Freight. Because Apex Freight no longer owned the routing software, they were legally required to license it from Sentinel in order to keep their trucks moving and their business operational. The contract was a masterpiece of lethal corporate strategy. It stipulated an exorbitant monthly licensing fee for the use of the proprietary software. However, my father had deliberately structured the payment schedule with an automatic deferment clause. For the past 24 months, Apex Freight had been utilizing the algorithm every single minute of every single day without paying a single red cent of the explicitly required monthly licensing fees upfront in cash. The deferment clause was tied to a specific terrifying penalty trigger. Upon my father's death, or in the event of a hostile change in majority corporate ownership, the exact scenario Sylvia had just orchestrated, the entire deferred balance became immediately due in full. Furthermore, the contract included a catastrophic penalty rate for late payments compounding daily. I pulled up my data analytics terminal and ran the numbers through a rapid projection model, calculating the 24 months of deferred licensing fees, multiplying it by the daily compounding penalty rate stipulated in the ironclad contract, and factoring in the sheer volume of daily usage by the massive logistics fleet. The final number materialized on my center monitor, glowing in stark, bright white text against the dark background. It was a figure so massive it almost defied comprehension. Apex Freight owed Sentinel Logistics Solutions $22 million. The payoff realization hit me with the force of a freight train, washing away my exhaustion and replacing it with a cold, electric thrill. I stood up from my ergonomic chair, my hands resting flat on the desk as I stared at the mathematical certainty of Sylvia's impending doom. She had fought tooth and nail in that mahogany conference room to steal what she thought was a thriving, incredibly lucrative corporate empire. She had smugly watched me waive my rights, entirely convinced she had successfully robbed the naive, grieving daughter of her rightful inheritance. She thought she was simply ascending to the grand throne. She had actually fought, schemed, and stolen her way into inheriting a completely hollow shell. The company she now proudly owned was a decaying carcass completely stripped of its only valuable asset. Even worse than being worthless, Apex Freight was catastrophically in debt. The $22 million invoice was a lethal corporate landmine just waiting to be stepped on, and the detonator rested securely in the palm of my hand. The company did not possess the liquid capital to pay off a fraction of that debt, especially not with Sylvia and Trent simultaneously bleeding the operating accounts dry to fund their illicit hidden offshore properties. Sylvia believed she had won the ultimate victory. She had no idea that she had just legally bound herself to a sinking ship, chaining her own financial future to a company that was fundamentally insolvent. By demanding absolute ownership of Apex Freight, she had unknowingly inherited its massive, inescapable liabilities. She did not hold the vast wealth she owed it directly to me. I walked over to the living room window, pulling back the blinds to watch the morning sun fully crest over the suburban horizon. The rain from the day of my eviction was gone, replaced by a sharp, clear sky. I thought about the cruel smirk on Preston's face as he threw my luggage onto the wet pavement. I thought about Kendall boasting about her unearned executive title. I thought about Sylvia's icy, condescending glare as she told DeAndre to take me back to his neighborhood, utterly convinced of her own absolute, untouchable superiority. They were all currently sitting in my childhood home, toasting their stolen wealth, with expensive champagne planning, lavish vacations, and buying luxury cars on corporate credit lines that were technically funded by my intellectual property. They were gorging themselves on a feast that had already been poisoned. The trap was perfectly laid, legally binding, and completely untraceable, until I decided to pull the curtain back. My father had trusted my analytical mind to find the evidence, but he had also trusted my restraint. He knew I would not strike wildly or emotionally. He knew I would wait for the perfect moment to ensure maximum irreparable devastation. I let the blinds fall shut, plunging the room back into the soft glow of the computer monitors. I walked back to my desk, created a secure encrypted backup of the entire titanium drive, and synchronized it to a remote cloud server located outside the country. I gathered the digital copies of the licensing agreement, the Delaware Limited Liability Company registration, and the staggering $22 million invoice that I was now legally authorized to execute at my sole discretion. I printed physical copies of the most damaging documents, the crisp pages sliding out of the printer with a rhythmic, satisfying hum. My extremely greedy stepmother demanded the entire massive logistics kingdom, and I was going to gladly let her keep every single piece of it. The caller ID on my cell phone illuminated the dark surface of my desk. Sylvia. It had been 9 days since she had me escorted out of the Apex Freight headquarters, and 13 days since she threw my sister and me out into the freezing Chicago rain. I watched the screen glow. I knew exactly why she was calling. The multinational conglomerate she was trying to sell my father's company to had undoubtedly conducted their due diligence. Their forensic auditors would have discovered the gaping hole at the center of the enterprise. They would have realized that Apex Freight did not own the proprietary supply chain optimization algorithm. The deal was stalled and Sylvia was suffocating in a panic of her own making. I picked up the phone on the 5th ring and pressed it to my ear, remaining completely silent. I wanted her to speak first. I needed to hear the precise pitch of her desperation. "Paige, sweetheart." Sylvia's voice poured through the speaker, dripping with artificial warmth that made my stomach churn. "I was hoping you would pick up. How are you holding up? How is Gwen?" The audacity of her tone was breathtaking. She spoke with the gentle concern of a loving mother, checking in on a sick child entirely, ignoring the reality that she had intentionally canceled Gwen's fertility insurance coverage days ago. She glossed over the fact that she had stripped away our livelihoods, our childhood home, and our financial stability. "We are managing," I replied. I kept my voice deliberately flat, modulating my vocal cords to project the hollow, defeated sound of a woman who had completely given up the fight. "I am so glad to hear that," Sylvia sighed, projecting false relief. "I know the transition has been difficult for everyone. Grief makes us all do and say things we do not mean. I hold absolutely no resentment toward you or your sister. We are family, Paige. Family goes through rough patches, but we always find our way back to each other." I pressed my lips together tightly, preventing a dark laugh from escaping. She was actively gaslighting me, attempting to reframe her calculated theft as a mere emotional misunderstanding. I did not contradict her. I let her continue building her fragile narrative, playing the submissive role she expected me to adopt. I murmured a quiet sound of agreement, yielding the floor entirely to her. Anyway, Sylvia continued, her tone shifting slightly, becoming breezy. The real reason I am calling is a tiny administrative matter. Your father was a brilliant man, but his office filing system was a disaster. We are trying to clean out the corporate archives to modernize the record keeping, and the legal team found a few outdated documents floating around. Here it comes, I thought, my eyes locking onto the glowing monitors of my data terminal. The bait. It is nothing important, Sylvia insisted, her voice dismissive. Just some ancient compliance paperwork regarding that old routing software your father toyed around with years ago. Apparently, because your name was listed on some developmental drafts back when you were a teenager, the system flagged it. Lawyer Loxley says we just need your quick signature on a standard waiver to clear the bureaucratic red tape and officially archive the files. It is a completely meaningless formality. A meaningless formality. She was referring to the absolute relinquishment of my intellectual property. She was asking me to blindly sign away a $22 million debt and hand over the digital brain of a massive logistics empire, pretending it was just dusty office clutter. Trent had clearly coached her on how to pitch this to me. They assumed that as a data analyst, I lacked the legal comprehension to understand the true value of an intellectual property waiver. They thought I was a broken girl who would sign anything just to avoid further conflict. A waiver, I repeated softly, injecting hesitation into my voice. I do not know, Sylvia. I am really trying to put Apex Freight behind me. I do not want to be involved in the company paperwork anymore. Caldwell told me I should not sign any more legal documents without having him review them first. I heard a sharp, almost imperceptible intake of breath on the other end of the line. The mention of my attorney struck a nerve. Oh, Paige, do not be silly, Sylvia chuckled, though the sound was strained. There is absolutely no need to bother poor Mr. Caldwell with this administrative garbage. He is a very busy man, and lawyers charge by the hour for every little page they read. You do not want to waste your limited savings on legal fees for a standard archival release. I am just trying to tidy up your father's mess. You know how much he hated loose ends. She was weaponizing my father's memory against me, using his legacy to manipulate my compliance. It was a masterclass in psychological abuse. I remained silent for a long, drawn-out moment, letting the tension stretch until I knew she was grinding her teeth in frustration. I just want to be left alone, I finally whispered, channeling the perfect image of a thoroughly beaten opponent. I just want to focus on helping Gwen and DeAndre figure out their medical bills. I am so sorry about that insurance mix-up. Sylvia pivoted instantly, her voice dripping with fabricated sympathy. The Human Resources Department was overzealous with the transition protocols. I scolded them terribly when I found out. In fact, that is another reason I called. I want to make things right between us. I want to help Gwen. I narrowed my eyes at the glowing screen. She was dangling a financial carrot, implicitly promising to reinstate the fertility coverage or offer a cash settlement in exchange for my signature on the waiver. I want us to heal, Sylvia continued, sensing my manufactured hesitation. Let us stop fighting, Paige. I would love it if you, Gwen, and DeAndre came over to the house tomorrow night. I am hosting a private family dinner, just us. We can share a beautiful meal, talk through everything, and sign this silly waiver to put the past behind us. We can discuss how I might be able to help fund Gwen's treatments. Please, Paige. She was inviting me back into the $5 million mansion she had violently evicted me from. She was offering to host me in my own childhood home, using my sister's devastating infertility struggles as a bargaining chip to steal my intellectual property. The sheer depravity of her strategy was astounding. She genuinely believed that a warm meal and a fake apology would buy her a corporate acquisition. I looked at the decrypted files on my desktop. The bank routing numbers, the offshore accounts, the undeniable proof of her and Trent bleeding my father's company dry. I thought about DeAndre pacing his living room floor, nearly sacrificing his financial future to sign a loan because of her cruelty. I thought about Gwen crying. I will come, I said quietly. Oh, wonderful, Sylvia exclaimed, her relief so profound it echoed through the receiver. It will be so good to have the family back together under one roof. We will eat at 7. See you tomorrow, sweetheart. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my desk. The silence in my apartment felt heavy. She had set the trap expecting the naive stepdaughter to walk blindly into its jaws. She had completely underestimated the predator she had invited into her home. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed DeAndre's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with lingering stress from the past 2 weeks. "We have an invitation to dinner tomorrow night," I told him, my voice dropping the facade of weakness and returning to its natural commanding cadence. "Sylvia is hosting us at the mansion." There was a heavy pause on the line. DeAndre is a brilliant, perceptive man. He knew my stance on Sylvia, and he knew I would never subject Gwen to another round of emotional abuse without a calculated reason. "Are you out of your mind?" Paige, DeAndre asked, his protective instincts instantly flaring. "That woman humiliated my wife. She insulted my background to my face. I am not bringing Gwen back into that toxic environment to be mocked while Sylvia pretends to play the gracious hostess." "I know exactly what she is doing," I assured him quickly. "She hit a brick wall with her corporate buyout. She discovered she does not own the routing algorithm, and now she is trying to trick me into signing a waiver to hand over the intellectual property rights. She is using the dinner as a sweet talk trap. She thinks we are desperate enough to trade a valuable asset for a plate of expensive food." Another pause followed this one, charged with sudden dawning comprehension. DeAndre's architectural mind immediately grasped the structural integrity of the situation. "So why are we going?" he asked, his tone shifting from defensive anger to strategic curiosity. "Because," I replied, staring at the titanium drive beside my keyboard. "While she is busy gloating over dessert and trying to force a pen into my hand, I need to get inside my father's old home office. Trent has taken it over, and I need access to his personal network router. I need you there to keep Sylvia, Preston, and Kendall completely occupied in the dining room. I need you to be the perfect distraction while I plant a digital Trojan horse into their network." I could hear the slow, steady intake of DeAndre's breath over the phone. He understood the monumental risk and the absolute necessity of the mission. We were walking back into the lion's den, not to surrender, but to ensure the lion never made it out alive. "Wear a nice suit," I told my brother-in-law, my voice cold as ice. "We are going to smile, we are going to eat her food, and we are going to let her think she has completely won. And then we are going to burn her stolen empire to the ground." "Count me in," DeAndre said firmly. I hung up the phone and slowly turned back to my glowing monitors, beginning to carefully code the complex packet sniffing script that I would permanently deploy tomorrow night. The sweet talk trap was firmly set, but Sylvia was the one walking directly into the snare. She thought she won. She was the actual prey. DeAndre parked his reliable, unassuming sedan at the base of the sweeping circular driveway of my childhood home. The $5 million estate loomed ahead of us against the darkening, stormy Chicago sky. Every single massive window was brilliantly illuminated, casting a golden, opulent glow across the perfectly manicured lawns. It was a grotesque, nauseating display of stolen comfort. I stepped out of the car, feeling the crisp, biting evening air against my skin. Gwen walked close beside me, her posture incredibly rigid with severe anxiety. DeAndre placed a reassuring heavy hand on her lower back, guiding her forward. We approached the massive custom oak doors that I had been violently thrown out of just 2 weeks prior. Sylvia did not open the door herself. She had hired private, expensive catering staff for a simple family dinner, a blatant, intentional flex of her newly acquired financial dominance. A server in a crisp white uniform politely ushered us into the grand marble foyer. The cavernous space echoed with loud, arrogant laughter, coming directly from the formal living room. We walked through the wide, arched doorway and found Preston and Kendall holding court. They were already several drinks deep, lounging lazily on the custom Italian leather sofas like true royalty. Preston rolled up the sleeve of his tailored designer blazer to deliberately expose his wrist. A brand new heavy platinum luxury watch caught the bright light of the dripping crystal chandelier overhead. He boasted loudly to Trent about the twin-turbocharged imported sports car he had just custom ordered that very morning, explicitly mentioning that he had put the massive $80,000 down payment directly on his new Apex Freight corporate executive credit card. Kendall instantly chimed in, swirling a dirty martini in her glass, aggressively bragging about a highly exclusive six-figure shopping spree in Paris she was meticulously planning for the upcoming month. The nauseating reality of their twisted celebration hit me like a physical, suffocating wave. They were mindlessly burning through critical corporate capital at an astonishing, reckless rate, financing their pathetic vanities with the intellectual property that legally belonged to me. Sylvia glided effortlessly into the crowded room wearing a flowing silk emerald gown that looked entirely custom-made. Trent stood faithfully and proudly at her side, perfectly playing the role of the benevolent patriarch, a sickening, repulsive replacement for my brilliant father. Sylvia greeted us with a saccharine-practiced smile that absolutely did not reach her cold, predatory eyes. She gracefully gestured toward the formal dining room, instructing us to take our assigned seats. The long mahogany table was impeccably set with my late mother's vintage fine china, heavy silver flatware, and towering floral arrangements that reeked of wasted money. As the hired staff silently served the first course of seared scallops, the psychological warfare officially commenced. Sylvia and Trent operated in perfect malicious tandem. They did not shout or hurl outright vulgar insults. Instead, they masterfully utilized the subtle, sophisticated cruelty of the social elite. Trent carved his rare steak and casually turned his arrogant attention to DeAndre. With a highly condescending smirk, Trent inquired about the current state of DeAndre's independent architectural firm, specifically asking if he was still struggling desperately to secure major commercial contracts in this notoriously tough economic climate. Trent smoothly suggested that perhaps DeAndre fundamentally lacked the aggressive, cutthroat corporate instincts required to truly play in the big leagues, heavily implying that his career was permanently destined to remain stagnant, unprofitable, and entirely mediocre. DeAndre's strong jaw instantly locked. I clearly saw the thick muscles in his neck pull incredibly tight. He was a vastly superior intellect and a phenomenally talented architect, but Trent was purposefully and strategically trying to make him feel exceedingly small and inadequate in front of his grieving wife. Before DeAndre could formulate a measured professional response, Sylvia seamlessly picked up the conversational baton, turning her predatory, hyper-focused attention directly onto Gwen. Sylvia leaned forward, resting her sharp chin on her perfectly manicured hands, and adopted a tone of dripping, false maternal sympathy. She asked Gwen how she was coping with the unfortunate tragic halt of her vital medical procedures. Sylvia sighed heavily, stating it was a terrible, unavoidable shame that the corporate health insurance policies had to be restructured so abruptly following my father's passing. She looked slowly around the lavish, excessively funded dining room, taking in the crystal and silver, and then looked back at my devastated sister. Sylvia noted how incredibly expensive in vitro fertilization must be for a young, struggling couple living on such a restrictive, tight budget. She offered a mockingly sympathetic frown, suggesting that perhaps Gwen and DeAndre were simply not financially or emotionally equipped to bring a child into the world right now anyway. Sylvia smoothly added that raising children required substantial, undeniable resources, and it would be deeply irresponsible and incredibly selfish to start a new family while actively drowning in crushing medical debt. She was shamelessly utilizing the vast wealth she had stolen directly from our father to actively mock my sister's devastating poverty and broken dreams. The cruelty was perfectly surgical and absolutely breathtaking. Gwen's breath hitched sharply in the quiet room. Her eyes rapidly welled with bright, humiliating tears that she fought desperately to hold back from spilling over her cheeks. She dropped her gaze to her porcelain plate, her hands trembling violently in her lap as she tried to make herself invisible. DeAndre dropped his heavy silver fork. The loud, metallic clatter rang out sharply in the tense dining room, silencing the room. His dark eyes blazed with a fierce, protective, and violent fury. He shifted his broad shoulders, fully prepared to stand up, flip the heavy mahogany table over, and drag his crying wife out of this highly toxic, abusive environment. I immediately caught DeAndre's eye directly across the massive floral centerpiece. I gave him a single microscopic shake of my head. I widened my eyes just a tiny fraction, projecting a silent, desperate, and commanding plea. Hold the line. Do not give them the explosive reaction they desperately want. Let them gorge themselves blindly on their own arrogance. DeAndre inhaled a slow, ragged, shaking breath through his nose. He reached under the table, gripping Gwen's trembling hand tightly in his own warm grasp, anchoring her firmly to reality. He swallowed his immense pride and remained seated, enduring the horrific, calculated disrespect solely for my sake and the ultimate success of the mission. I turned my complete attention back to Sylvia and Trent. They were watching me closely, eagerly, waiting for me to shatter into a million pieces. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg them pathetically for a small fraction of my father's stolen wealth to save my sister's future. Instead, I absorbed every single toxic insult and vile implication with an eerie, placid, and completely unwavering smile. I intentionally allowed my shoulders to slump slightly physically, manifesting the posture of a completely defeated, broken, and submissive woman. I looked directly at Sylvia with wide, innocent, and compliant eyes. I told her in a soft, weary, and highly convincing voice that I completely understood her position. I stated calmly that she was absolutely right about the harsh financial realities we were facing and that fighting blindly against the inevitable changes was simply too exhausting for me to handle anymore. Sylvia's rigid posture instantly relaxed. The defensive tension in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a radiant, victorious, and glowing satisfaction. She believed she had finally broken the last remaining obstacle, holding out against her absolute reign. Taking full advantage of my manufactured vulnerability, Sylvia casually brought up the administrative paperwork she had mentioned during our phone call. She waved her hand dismissively in the air, stating that Lawyer Loxley had already prepared the standard software waiver document. She reiterated smoothly that it was just a tedious, boring corporate technicality required to officially clear out my father's old, highly irrelevant developmental archives. She asked politely if I would be willing to attend a brief informal board meeting at the main Apex Freight headquarters on Friday morning to officially sign the document and close this messy chapter for good. I kept my eerie, placid smile perfectly fixed in place. I looked directly into the dark eyes of the woman who had ruined my family, stolen my father's legacy, and was currently mocking my sister's deepest pain. I nodded slowly, projecting absolute, unquestioning compliance to her request. I told Sylvia that I would absolutely be there without fail. I promised her sweetly that I would sign whatever legal waiver she needed to help her clean up the old archives and finalize the corporate transition smoothly. Sylvia leaned back gracefully, sharing a highly smug, victorious look with Trent. They genuinely thought I was a broken, clueless girl willingly surrendering my $22 million asset. They had absolutely no idea my compliance was a deadly trap, and their total annihilation was imminent. The tension hanging over the dining room table at the mansion was palpable, thick enough to be sliced with a knife. Sylvia and Trent had spent the last two courses expertly lobbing thinly veiled insults at DeAndre and Gwen, dissecting DeAndre's architectural career and Gwen's heartbreaking medical struggles with the surgical precision of seasoned sociopaths. They were actively gorging themselves on the misery of others. Their malicious satisfaction fueled by the $20 million payday they mistakenly believed was sitting safely in their offshore accounts. I had absorbed every single toxic barb they threw, maintaining a perfectly placid, submissive smile that clearly convinced them I was entirely defeated. I agreed to attend the final board meeting to sign the fictitious software waiver, playing the role of the compliant, clueless stepdaughter, to absolute perfection. Sylvia and Trent exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated triumph over the remnants of their decadent dessert. The sweet-talk trap they had carefully laid seemed in their arrogant eyes to have functioned flawlessly. I waited until the hired catering staff began clearing the heavy china plates before making my move. I delicately dabbed the corners of my mouth with a linen napkin, politely excused myself to use the restroom, and stood up from the mahogany table. DeAndre caught my eye for a fraction of a second, his dark gaze steady and unwavering. He immediately leaned forward, engaging Trent in a detailed, highly technical conversation about the specific structural zoning permits required for commercial warehouse expansion. It was a brilliant, calculated distraction. Trent, ever the arrogant executive, eagerly took the bait, leaning into the conversation to assert his dominance, while Sylvia watched them both with a patronizing smirk. With their attention completely diverted, I slipped silently out of the formal dining room and moved swiftly down the dimly lit hallway toward the east wing of the sprawling estate. My heart hammered a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs as I approached the heavy oak double doors of my father's former home office. Trent had aggressively claimed this space the very day after the funeral, stripping away my father's personal artifacts and replacing them with his own sterile modern decor. The heavy brass doorknob turned smoothly under my grip. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me with a soft, nearly silent click, instantly plunging myself into the dark, familiar space. The only illumination came from the ambient moonlight filtering through the tall windows overlooking the manicured grounds. I did not dare turn on the overhead lights. I moved purposefully toward the massive custom-built executive desk, dominating the center of the room. Trent was a careless man, arrogant enough to believe his stolen empire was entirely untouchable. He had left his primary workstation powered on the monitors asleep, but the system fully active. I crouched beneath the heavy wooden desk, my fingers tracing the familiar tangle of cables until I located the primary network router mounted securely against the back panel. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and pulled out the small, heavily modified flash drive I had painstakingly programmed the night before in my apartment. This was not a standard storage device. It was a highly sophisticated digital Trojan horse engineered to execute a silent, invisible deployment the moment it connected to a network. I took a deep, steadying breath, aligning the metal connector with the open port on the router. I pushed it in firmly. A tiny microscopic LED light on the side of the drive pulsed green, once confirming the connection was secure. The custom packet sniffing script initiated immediately. It was designed to stealthily burrow into the mansion's core Wi-Fi network, establishing a secure, encrypted tunnel directly back to the isolated server I had set up in my apartment. Every single piece of outgoing digital traffic, every email sent, every financial transaction authorized, every secure portal accessed from this house would now be perfectly mirrored and silently transmitted directly into my waiting hands. Trent and Sylvia believed they were operating behind an impenetrable wall of corporate security. They had no idea I had just permanently compromised their entire digital infrastructure from the inside out. I waited exactly 60 seconds, mentally counting down the time required for the malicious script to fully integrate and bury itself within the router's firmware. Once the silent installation was complete, I carefully extracted the physical flash drive, slipping it safely back into my blazer pocket. I stood up, smoothing the front of my clothes, my eyes scanning the dark office one last time to ensure I had left absolutely no trace of my presence. The room looked exactly as it had when I entered. I turned the brass doorknob and slipped back out into the quiet hallway, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. I walked purposefully back toward the formal dining room, my expression resetting into the mild, defeated mask I had worn all evening. As I entered the room, DeAndre was smoothly wrapping up his fabricated debate with Trent about commercial zoning laws, nodding thoughtfully as Trent delivered a final, highly condescending piece of unsolicited advice. Sylvia was delicately sipping the last of her expensive wine, her eyes glittering with the self-satisfaction of a woman who believed she held all the cards. I returned to my seat beside Gwen, offering a small, apologetic smile for my absence. "Well," Sylvia announced, setting her crystal glass down with a delicate clink, "I think this has been a wonderfully productive evening. It is so important that we heal these family rifts and move forward together." She looked directly at me, her gaze heavy with expectation. "And we will see you at the headquarters on Friday morning, Paige. Just to quickly sign that silly little waiver and get the archives sorted." "Yes, Sylvia," I replied, my voice steady and perfectly compliant. "I will be there on Friday." "Excellent," she beamed, sharing another deeply smug look with Trent. I am so glad we could get this sorted out like reasonable adults. It really is for the best. DeAndre stood up respectfully, signaling the end of the excruciating evening. He helped Gwen out of her chair, his protective presence a stark contrast to the venomous atmosphere in the room. We gathered our coats in the grand marble foyer, the hired catering staff hovering silently in the background. Sylvia and Trent stood by the open front door, playing the gracious host to perfection. They offered empty, superficial pleasantries as we stepped out into the crisp Chicago night, their voices dripping with fake sincerity. I said my final goodbyes, promising once again to be entirely cooperative at the upcoming board meeting. As DeAndre's car pulled away from the sweeping circular driveway, the heavy facade I had meticulously maintained all evening finally dropped. I let out a long, slow breath, sinking back into the leather upholstery of the back seat. Gwen reached out and squeezed my hand in the darkness of the car, her earlier anxiety replaced by a quiet, determined solidarity. DeAndre glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his dark eyes meeting mine. "Is it done?" he asked softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. "It is done," I confirmed, feeling the cold, hard weight of the flash drive in my pocket. "The script is running. We are mirroring their entire network." The drive back to my suburban apartment was wrapped in a tense, expectant silence. The sweet talk trap had been sprung, but not in the way Sylvia had anticipated. She believed she had successfully manipulated a grieving, desperate daughter into surrendering the keys to a $20 million empire for the price of a fancy dinner and a few hollow promises. She had aggressively pushed for the Friday board meeting, eager to finalize her massive theft and secure her illicit buyout. What she did not realize was that the meeting she was so desperately rushing toward would not be the triumphant culmination of her grand scheme. It would be the site of her absolute public execution. The digital Trojan horse was already silently gathering the critical data I needed to destroy them both. The trap was now fully set, and the countdown to the final devastating confrontation had officially begun. I watched the city lights blur past the window, my mind already organizing the incoming data streams ready to dissect the final darkest secrets my father had left behind. The drive back from the mansion felt like crossing the threshold into an entirely new reality. Over the next 48 hours, my modest suburban apartment transformed into a digital war room. DeAndre and I barely slept, fueled by black coffee and a relentless drive to dismantle my stepmother's stolen empire. My custom packet-sniffing script performed flawlessly, operating like an invisible parasite burrowed deep inside Trent's personal network router. Every single byte of data that flowed through the mansion's internet connection was instantly mirrored, encrypted, and funneled directly into my local servers. We sat side by side at my multi-monitor workstation, silently processing the sheer volume of intercepted communications, financial transfers, and corporate documents Trent blindly believed were secure. DeAndre proved to be an invaluable asset in interpreting the complex web of physical assets Sylvia and Trent were acquiring. While I untangled the routing of embezzled Apex freight funds, DeAndre utilized his architectural background to dissect the intercepted offshore property deeds. Trent had carelessly transferred massive sums of corporate capital into shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Belize. Scanning the intercepted blueprints and luxury real estate contracts, DeAndre identified a pattern standard auditors would have easily missed. The shell companies were actively developing sprawling beachfront villas. DeAndre explained how Trent was laundering the stolen money through grossly inflated construction costs to build a massive, untraceable retirement paradise, fully funded by the intellectual property that legally belonged to me. Pulling up an architectural rendering of a grand estate perched on a private peninsula, DeAndre proved this was a fully realized escape route. They were actively preparing to vanish into luxury the very second they successfully finalized the corporate buyout of my father's hollowed-out company. While DeAndre systematically cataloged the offshore real estate portfolio, I shifted my focus to Trent's private internal communications. I bypassed his email passwords, using keystroke logs captured by my Trojan horse, diving into the deepest secure archives of his digital life. I was searching for the final pieces of the financial puzzle, looking for the exact paper trail that connected Sylvia to the fraudulent transfers. Instead, I stumbled upon a hidden, heavily encrypted directory buried within his personal cloud storage. The folder was cryptically named with a date. I recognized that specific string of numbers instantly. It was the exact date my father passed away. A sudden suffocating chill settled heavily over my shoulders. I clicked open the directory. Inside were two distinct files. The first was a raw, unedited security log exported directly from the Smart Office Management System installed in my father's executive suite at Apex Freight. The second file was a highly compressed audio transcript generated by the company's voice dictation software that my father routinely used to draft his logistical contracts. My hands began to tremble as I opened the security log, my eyes tracking the precise digital timestamps tracking movement in and out of the executive suite on that fateful afternoon. The data showed Trent entered my father's office at precisely 2:14 in the afternoon. The system registered the door closing and locking from the inside. I opened the corresponding audio transcript, my breath catching painfully in my throat. The dictation software had been actively running in the background, capturing every spoken word and ambient sound in the room. The transcript documented a heated, rapidly escalating argument between my father and Trent. My father had confronted his chief financial officer with the undeniable proof of the embezzlement and the sickening reality of the ongoing affair with Sylvia. The text showed my father's booming voice demanding immediate resignations and threatening to contact federal authorities. He stated he was finalizing his brutal divorce proceedings against Sylvia the very next morning, a maneuver that would permanently sever her access to his wealth and leave her with nothing. Then the transcript captured a sudden, horrifying shift. The text displayed a series of sharp, panicked gasps from my father, followed by the heavy, unmistakable sound of a body collapsing against the wooden desk and crashing to the floor. My father had gone into massive cardiac arrest, triggered by the intense stress of the confrontation. I stared at the timestamps, the cold blue light of the monitor illuminating the absolute darkest truth imaginable. My father had hit the floor at exactly 2:21. The medical examiner had previously concluded that a swift emergency response could have easily saved his life, given his proximity to a major downtown hospital. I looked back at the security log tracking Trent's movements. He did not unlock the door or shout for the medical team. The digital logs proved Trent remained perfectly still inside that locked office, listening to the man who built the company fight a losing battle for oxygen. The audio transcript recorded the agonizing silence punctuated only by my father's fading struggles to breathe. Trent deliberately waited for 15 agonizing minutes. He stood there watching my father slowly die, ensuring the divorce proceedings would never be finalized and Sylvia would inherit the entire estate. The log showed Trent finally placing the call to emergency services at 2:36, far too late for paramedics to perform any life-saving interventions. The gravity of the revelation ripped the oxygen from my lungs. The conflict instantly shifted. This was no longer simple corporate theft or property disputes. This was a cold-blooded execution by intentional neglect. They had murdered my father just to secure their payday. The sickening reality transformed the nature of my retaliation. They did not just steal my legacy, they brutally stole the life of the only parent who truly loved me. DeAndre noticed the sudden profound silence radiating from my side of the desk. He turned his attention away from the offshore property blueprints and looked at the glowing screen I was staring at. I could not find the vocal strength to explain the horrifying contents of the transcript. I simply pointed a shaking finger at the digital timestamps aligning the fatal heart attack with Trent's deliberate agonizing delay. DeAndre leaned in, his eyes rapidly scanning the auto-generated text and the corresponding security logs. As the devastating reality of the document clicked into place, the blood drained completely from his face. A low, fierce sound of absolute disgust escaped his throat. He pushed his chair back violently, standing up and pacing the small confines of my home office, running his hands over his head as he processed the sheer, unadulterated evil we had just uncovered. They deliberately let him die. DeAndre whispered, his deep voice trembling with sudden explosive rage. Paige, I swear this is negligent homicide. This is murder. We have to call the police right now and have them arrested tonight. I sat motionless in my chair, staring at the glowing monitors through tear-filled eyes. The profound grief, temporarily suppressed by my analytical focus, rushed back, hitting me with a devastating physical blow. The image of my protective father collapsing onto the floor, desperately reaching for help that was deliberately denied, burned permanently into my mind. He had loved me with every fiber of his being, and his reward was an agonizing death orchestrated by the exact people he had generously provided for. A hot, silent tear slipped down my cheek. The overwhelming pain threatened to shatter my composure, but my cold, calculating logic quickly reasserted dominance. Calling the police now would trigger a chaotic investigation, giving Sylvia and Trent the opportunity to hire expensive defense attorneys, spin a web of lies, and potentially flee the country to their offshore safe havens. I completely refused to ever let them escape the dire consequences. They had brutally exploited my father's brilliant company to construct an illicit retirement paradise on beautiful tropical islands. If I rushed blindly to the authorities, they could instantly liquidate their remaining domestic assets and vanish without a single trace. I deeply wanted to look directly into my cruel stepmother's eyes, while she confidently believed she had flawlessly secured her ultimate prize. I wanted to see Trent violently realize his own immense arrogance had finally destroyed him. They needed to believe they were walking into a standard board meeting to finalize an administrative waiver. They needed to feel completely safe, entirely arrogant, and totally untouchable right up until the exact second their world completely evaporated. I gently wiped the tear from my face, my expression hardening into a mask of pure surgical ice. I looked at DeAndre, my voice stripped of all grief, vibrating with a deadly calm. "We are not calling the police tonight," I stated. "We are going to compile every piece of this data into an undeniable digital dossier." I began typing rapidly across my keyboard, initiating the secure compression protocols. "Tomorrow morning, Sylvia and Trent are expecting me to hand them the keys to a $20 million empire. Instead, I am going to walk into that glass boardroom and deliver their absolute destruction." The executioner was ready. The adrenaline from discovering the audio transcript evaporated, leaving behind a suffocating weight. As I stared at the monitor displaying the exact 15 minutes my father suffered in deliberate isolation, my logical architecture failed. I could not process it as raw data anymore. That was my father. He proudly attended my college presentations and built a logistics empire to ensure his daughters would never know financial hardship. He had been terrified, completely helpless, and in agonizing, unimaginable pain, reaching out for medical help that was intentionally and maliciously withheld by the very people he generously employed. DeAndre saw the light leave my eyes. He pulled his phone from his pocket and immediately dialed Gwen urgently, telling his beloved wife to come to my apartment right away, without elaborating on the horrifying details over a phone call. When Gwen unlocked my front door 20 minutes later, she took one look at our devastated faces and dropped her handbag onto the floor. I tried to stand up to greet her, to explain the horrific truth we had uncovered hidden inside Trent's network drive. I tried to say that Sylvia and Trent had murdered him, but all that escaped my lips was a ragged, broken gasp. The stoic facade I had meticulously maintained since the funeral violently shattered into a million pieces. My knees gave out entirely. I collapsed heavily onto the hardwood floor of my home office, desperately clutching my chest, as if physically trying to hold my own broken heart together. Gwen rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside me. DeAndre knelt on my other side, wrapping his strong arms around both of us. I sobbed with a raw, primal ferocity that tore at my throat. I wept for the agonizing betrayal my father experienced in his final moments. For several intense minutes, the three of us huddled together on the floor, holding each other tightly as the devastating reality of his murder washed over us in crushing waves. Gwen cried just as fiercely, her hot tears soaking deeply into my sweater, as DeAndre gently rocked us back and forth. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply anchored us, providing a safe space for our trauma to run its natural course. But the intense breakdown could not last. The final board meeting was approaching rapidly, and Sylvia was sleeping soundly in my childhood home, dreaming of a massive corporate buyout she believed was guaranteed. Slowly, the violent shaking in my shoulders began to subside. The tears stopped falling, replaced by a sudden, terrifying emptiness. I pulled back from my sister and brother-in-law, wiping my face with the back of my hand. I stood up. The profound, paralyzing grief that had crippled me was entirely gone. In its place was a state of surgical coldness. I walked into my small bathroom and splashed freezing water onto my face, staring directly into my own eyes in the mirror. I did not look like a grieving daughter anymore. I looked like a machine. I walked back into the home office and sat in my ergonomic chair, placing my hands flat on the desk. I looked at the glowing monitors, no longer seeing a tragedy, but a highly complex mathematical equation that required a lethal solution. I explained the entire situation to Gwen, my voice completely devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I told her about the offshore shell companies, the impending $20 million corporate buyout Sylvia was desperately trying to finalize, and the massive licensing debt Apex Freight currently owed my hidden entity. Finally, I showed her the audio transcript detailing the calculated delay. Gwen's initial sorrow instantly hardened into a blinding anger. She demanded we call the police right that second to have them dragged out of the mansion in handcuffs. But DeAndre interjected perfectly, understanding my silent strategy. A standard police arrest would tip them off prematurely. Sylvia would immediately hire expensive defense attorneys to stall the investigation, claiming the audio transcript was circumstantial. They might even try to flee the country using the millions they had successfully embezzled. We needed to corner them publicly, legally, and financially, all at the exact same time, leaving them with absolutely zero avenues of escape. I turned my attention back to the triple monitors illuminating my desk. It was time to compile the ultimate digital dossier. I opened a new, heavily encrypted master folder and began systematically dragging and dropping the files into a meticulously organized sequence. This could not just be a collection of random stolen documents, it had to be an irrefutable narrative of premeditated corporate fraud culminating in negligent homicide. I started with the financial records. I extracted the raw data logs showing the exact routing numbers Trent used to siphon money out of the Apex Freight operational accounts. I matched those outbound transfers directly to the inbound deposits at the offshore banks located in Belize and the Cayman Islands. DeAndre sat beside me, mapping the geographical coordinates and property deeds he had traced. We attached the architectural blueprints for the massive beachfront estates they were secretly constructing, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the embezzled funds were being converted into hidden luxury assets. Next, I layered in the interpersonal evidence. I included the intercepted text messages, hotel receipts, and private emails that undeniably established the long-standing romantic affair between Sylvia and Trent. This established their clear motive. They were entirely colluding to remove my father from the equation and steal his entire fortune to quietly fund their new life together far away from Chicago. The final, most critical component of the dossier was the murder evidence. I carefully extracted the smart office management security logs, showing Trent locking the door from the inside at 2:14 in the afternoon. I paired it directly with the auto-generated audio transcript, capturing my father's confrontation, his subsequent collapse, and the 15 agonizing minutes of deliberate, calculated silence that followed. I even pulled the public emergency dispatch records to highlight the exact timestamp when Trent finally decided to call 911, proving the fatal delay was an intentional, malicious, and entirely deadly choice rather than a momentary panic. I reviewed the entire package from top to bottom. It was devastatingly comprehensive. A seasoned federal prosecutor would not even need to conduct a preliminary investigation. The entire case was gift-wrapped, cross-referenced, and digitally authenticated. I ran a custom script to lock the master folder behind a dynamic two-factor cryptographic wall, ensuring the exact contents could not be tampered with, deleted, or corrupted once successfully transmitted. With the lethal dossier fully assembled, I moved to the final phase of the operation. I accessed the dark web using a highly secure, untraceable virtual private network, ensuring my digital footprint remained completely invisible. I navigated to the official reporting portals for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division and the local Chicago District Attorney's Major Crimes Unit. I uploaded the heavily encrypted master folder to both agencies through anonymous, secure Dropboxes, but I did not provide them with the decryption key immediately. I needed to manually control the exact timing of the explosion. If the federal agents raided the mansion tonight, Sylvia and Trent would miss their scheduled board meeting tomorrow morning. I needed them to walk arrogantly into that glass boardroom, surrounded by their expensive lawyers and their stolen pride. I needed them to firmly believe they had finally won. I opened a specialized automated scheduling program. I typed out a short, concise message containing the complex 64-character alphanumeric decryption key. I programmed the system to automatically dispatch the email directly to the lead investigators at both federal and local agencies. I set the precise delivery time for 10:15 in the morning. That was exactly 15 minutes after my scheduled meeting with Sylvia was set to begin. The timing was perfectly calculated to allow me to spring my financial trap first, bankrupting her entirely just moments before the authorities arrived to strip away her freedom. The trap was now fully armed, and the digital timer was actively counting down. I securely logged out of the terminal and shut down my workstation. The room plunged into a soft, quiet darkness. Gwen and DeAndre stood up from the small sofa in my office, looking at me with a mixture of profound respect and quiet awe. They knew the grieving daughter was gone, replaced entirely by an instrument of absolute justice. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I bypassed the dark morning clothes I had worn for the past 2 weeks. Instead, I reached for a razor-sharp, immaculately tailored white suit. It was a suit designed exclusively for absolute power, for control, and for victory. I laid it carefully across the foot of my bed. I was completely ready for the arrival of the next morning. I was ready to watch their stolen empire completely burn down. When the sun rose over Chicago, I was wide awake. I moved through my morning routine with the mechanical precision of a soldier. I walked into my bedroom and stared at the immaculate white suit laid carefully across my bed. For 2 weeks, I had worn nothing but dark, shapeless morning clothes, physically manifesting the broken, helpless daughter my stepmother needed. That pathetic facade ended today. I slipped into the tailored white blazer and matching trousers. The fabric was crisp, structured, and projected an aura of unyielding authority. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style, applying a striking layer of makeup. Staring directly into the bathroom mirror, I did not see a grieving victim preparing for surrender. I saw an executioner preparing for a harvest. I gathered my briefcase, verifying it contained the Delaware Limited Liability Company registration, the master licensing agreement, and the $22 million invoice. I drove my sedan through the morning traffic, my mind synchronized with the digital timer counting down on my secure home server. The encrypted dossier containing proof of embezzlement and the horrifying audio logs of my father's intentional murder was scheduled to unlock for federal authorities in exactly 45 minutes. At 9:45, I pulled into the visitor parking lot of the Apex Freight headquarters. The glass and steel building towered above me. I walked purposefully through the revolving front doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. The security guards and front desk receptionists, the people who had watched Sylvia publicly terminate my employment just days ago, stared at me with wide, confused eyes. I bypassed the standard visitor security checkpoint entirely, utilizing the supreme executive access code my father had secretly embedded into my personal credentials years ago. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the expansive glass-walled boardroom. I walked slowly down the hallway, observing my enemies before they realized I had arrived. Through the transparent walls, I could see the parasitic council assembled and eagerly waiting for their absolute victory. Sylvia sat directly at the head of the mahogany table, occupying the leather executive chair that had belonged to my father. She wore a deep burgundy designer dress, projecting the image of a fearless corporate matriarch. Trent sat to her right, aggressively typing on his smartphone, oblivious to the terrifying fact that his freedom was currently resting in the hands of federal investigators. Preston and Kendall sprawled carelessly in their ergonomic seats, whispering quietly and suppressing laughter. Lawyer Loxley sat securely to Sylvia's left, his briefcase open, looking exactly like a predator anticipating a fresh kill. And then there was Mr. Caldwell. My father's loyal estate attorney sat isolated at the far end of the table, looking entirely out of place among the vultures. He was sweating profusely, repeatedly dabbing his damp forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. He genuinely believed he was about to witness the tragic surrender of Thomas's great legacy, unaware of the lethal trap I had meticulously constructed in the shadows. I pushed open the glass door and stepped confidently into the room. The quiet conversations died. Preston and Kendall stopped laughing, their eyes darting over my white suit in momentary confusion. Sylvia's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second before she rapidly reconstructed her mask of maternal superiority. Trent looked up from his smartphone, a smirk playing on his lips. I walked calmly to the empty seat directly across from Sylvia and sat down, placing my briefcase on the table. I folded my hands, neatly projecting an aura of absolute serenity. Right on time, Paige Sylvia announced, her voice echoing loudly in the tense boardroom. She gestured magnanimously toward the center of the table, her diamond bracelets clinking together. I am so incredibly glad you decided to be reasonable and cooperate with this corporate transition. It shows a level of maturity I honestly was not sure you possessed after your recent emotional outbursts. Mr. Caldwell leaned toward me, his voice a frantic whisper that barely concealed his underlying panic. Paige, please, you do not have to do this. We can still file the injunction. Do not sign anything today. You are giving away your only remaining leverage. I did not look at Caldwell. I kept my gaze locked unblinkingly on Sylvia. Lawyer Loxley slid a thick document across the mahogany surface until it rested perfectly aligned in front of me. The heading at the top of the page read, Waiver of Intellectual Property and Full Archival Release. Sylvia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a personal checkbook. She uncapped a gold fountain pen and theatrically wrote out a sum, tearing the check from the binding with a sharp rip. She slid the check across the table so it rested directly on top of the waiver document. I want to make absolutely sure you are taken care of while you search for a new data entry position somewhere else, Sylvia said, her tone dripping with condescension. There is $10,000 there. Consider it a generous parting gift, a little pocket money from me to help you get back on your feet. All you have to do is sign the bottom line, release those old files, and we can all move forward with our respective lives. Preston chuckled quietly, murmuring something to Kendall about how far $10,000 would go in the suburbs. Trent checked his watch, clearly impatient to finalize the $20 million buyout he believed was waiting for him. They were entirely convinced that they had successfully backed me into a corner. I looked down at the $10,000 check. Then I looked up at Sylvia and smiled. It was not a smile of defeat, nor was it a forced expression of compliance. It was a cold, radiant, and utterly terrifying smile. The sheer confidence radiating from my face caused the room's temperature to seemingly plummet. Sylvia's confident posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing as a sudden inexplicable flash of primal fear registered in her mind. I did not reach for the cheap plastic pen Loxley had provided. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and retrieved my own pen, the fountain pen my father had gifted me. I uncapped it with a click that echoed in the silent room. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, discreetly sliding it directly underneath the final signature page of the waiver. Without breaking eye contact with my stepmother, I pressed the tip of my father's pen to the top of her document. I drew a line straight through the heading of the waiver of intellectual property, crossing out the title. Loxley leaned forward, his brow furrowing in confusion at my alteration of his paperwork. I moved my hand to the bottom of the page and signed my name with precision, pressing the ink into the paper. I recapped my pen, placed it back into my pocket, and slid the stack of documents directly back across the massive table. The papers glided smoothly over the mahogany, coming to a perfect halt right in front of Lawyer Loxley. I did not touch the $10,000 check. I left it sitting exactly where Sylvia had placed it entirely, ignoring its existence. Locksley picked up the documents with a highly irritated sigh, clearly prepared to lecture me on the legal invalidity of crossing out a contract header. He glanced at my signature to verify it was complete, and then his eyes inevitably dropped to the addendum I had seamlessly slipped underneath the final page. I sat perfectly still, watching the exact moment the devastating reality crashed down upon him. The color drained from Locksley's face so rapidly, he looked as though he were suffering a cardiac event. His hands began to tremble violently, the paper shaking in his grip. His jaw dropped open, his eyes scanning the attached document a second time, frantically searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. The aura he had worn since the reading of the will completely vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute horror. Sylvia noticed her lawyer's catastrophic physical reaction. She frowned irritation, masking the sudden spike of panic in her chest. "What is it, Locksley?" she demanded sharply, leaning over to look at the papers. "Just file the paperwork so we can finalize the corporate acquisition." Locksley slowly lowered the documents, his terrified eyes rising to meet my calm, waiting gaze. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the dead silence of the boardroom. He turned his ashen face toward his client, his voice a barely audible broken stammer. "Sylvia!" He gasped, his professional composure entirely shattered. "Sylvia, this is not a waiver." I remained completely silent, simply watching the long-awaited execution finally begin to unfold today. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Sylvia snatched the document from Locksley's trembling hands. Her eyes darted frantically across the page, scanning the crisp text she had confidently assumed was a standard intellectual property waiver. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug sharply into the thick paper as her brain struggled to process the stark legal terminology printed before her. She looked up at her attorney, her voice sharp and demanding an immediate explanation. She ordered Locksley to tell her exactly what sort of ridiculous trick I was attempting to pull. Locksley opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. The slick, predatory corporate lawyer was completely paralyzed by the catastrophic financial liability sitting on the table. I did not give him the chance to find his voice. I stood up slowly from my chair, smoothing the lapels of my white suit, and rested my hands flat against the cool mahogany surface. I looked directly into my stepmother's eyes, commanding the entire room with a quiet, lethal authority. I told her that she was holding an immediate debt call. I explained that exactly 3 years ago, my brilliant father had quietly separated the proprietary supply chain optimization algorithm from the main Apex Freight corporate umbrella. He flawlessly transferred 100% of the intellectual property rights into an anonymous limited liability company, securely based in Delaware. I watched her pupils widen as I delivered the fatal blow. I informed her that the hidden entity was called Sentinel Logistics Solutions, and I was its sole uncontested owner. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather seat, his arrogant smirk melting rapidly into a mask of sudden apprehension. He demanded to know what nonsense I was talking about, insisting loudly that Apex Freight owned every single operational asset under its massive roof. I turned my cold gaze to the corrupt chief financial officer. I told him he was fundamentally wrong. I explained that for the past 24 months, Apex Freight had not legally owned the digital brain that made the physical fleet of trucks profitable. Instead, the company had been blindly leasing the routing software from my private entity. My father had deliberately structured the master licensing agreement with a deferred payment clause allowing the logistics company to utilize the algorithm every single day without paying any upfront cash. However, that specific deferment contained a catastrophic penalty trigger. In the event of my father's death or a hostile change in majority corporate ownership, the entire deferred balance became immediately due in full, subject to a punishing daily compound interest rate. Sylvia dropped the paper onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. She stammered wildly, her voice rapidly losing its aristocratic polish, arguing furiously that this was entirely impossible and demanding Locksley find a legal loophole to invalidate the absurd contract immediately. Locksley finally spoke, his tone completely defeated and hollow. He admitted the documentation was ironclad, heavily notarized, and fully executed long before her hostile takeover. He confirmed that Apex Freight was legally and permanently bound to the harsh terms of the agreement. I reached calmly into my briefcase, pulled out the final printed invoice, and placed it squarely in the center of the table. I announced the final mathematically undeniable total to the room. $22 million. I stated clearly that her company owed my company exactly $22 million payable immediately. Since she and Trent had been incredibly busy siphoning the operational capital to secretly fund their hidden offshore real estate projects, Apex Freight did not possess the liquid assets to cover even a tiny fraction of the massive debt. By aggressively claiming absolute ownership of the business, Sylvia had not inherited a massive fortune as she believed. She had inherited a completely hollow shell and an inescapable financial black hole. I declared that as of this exact second, Apex Freight was functionally and legally bankrupt, completely crushed under the weight of its own liabilities. The devastating reality of her total destruction finally shattered Sylvia's carefully constructed facade. The elegant status-obsessed Chicago socialite vanished completely, replaced by something wild and desperate. Her face contorted into a twisted mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in her neck bulged prominently as she let out a piercing hysterical scream that echoed violently against the glass walls of the boardroom. She lunged across the wide mahogany table, her hands hooked into vicious claws, desperately trying to physically attack me. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that I had maliciously set her up, that I was a manipulative monster who had ruined her perfect life. I did not even flinch. I stood perfectly still watching her thrash helplessly against the heavy wooden table. Lawyer Caldwell, sitting quietly at the far end of the room, watched the incredible scene unfold with absolute awe, suddenly realizing that the grieving daughter he thought was foolishly surrendering had actually executed the most brilliant corporate trap he had ever witnessed in his entire legal career. Preston jumped abruptly out of his ergonomic chair. His face was flushed crimson with profound entitlement and the sudden, terrifying realization of his own impending poverty. He realized his custom sports cars, his lavish luxury lifestyle, and his highly inflated, unearned executive salary had just evaporated completely into thin air. He shouted a vile curse and charged recklessly around the edge of the table. He aggressively reached out his hands to grab my shoulders, intending to physically force me to destroy the signed document and reverse the nightmare unfolding before his eyes. Right as Preston's heavy hand reached for the fabric of my tailored blazer, the heavy glass boardroom doors flew open with a deafening crash. DeAndre stood squarely in the doorway, his broad shoulders effectively blocking the main exit. His dark eyes blazed with a fierce protective intensity, but he did not need to throw a single physical punch to stop the impending violence. He simply held the heavy doors wide open, stepping slightly aside to make way for the ultimate consequence of their unchecked greed. A heavily armed team of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division swarmed rapidly into the room. They wore dark tactical vests over their crisp shirts and carried thick folders filled with freshly signed warrants. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice cutting sharply through the chaotic screaming with absolute, undeniable authority. He ordered Preston to step away from me immediately, flashing a bright gold badge that instantly drained the aggressive bravado from my stepbrother's rigid posture. Preston stumbled backward, raising his trembling hands in terrified surrender as reality crashed down upon him. Kendall pressed herself flat against the glass wall, weeping uncontrollably as she watched her false empire disintegrate. The federal agents moved with swift, practiced efficiency. Two officers immediately flanked Sylvia, grabbing her flailing arms and forcing her roughly back down into the executive chair she had so desperately coveted. The distinctive sharp click of heavy metal handcuffs echoing loudly in the silent room was the single most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The lead agent began reading Sylvia her Miranda rights, officially placing her under federal arrest for massive corporate fraud, grand embezzlement, and extensive criminal conspiracy. Trent realized the trap had fully closed around him, leaving absolutely no avenue for escape. The cowardly chief financial officer took one terrified look at the federal agents and instantly shattered under the immense pressure. He backed away from Sylvia, as if she were suddenly contagious, raising his hands defensively and frantically shouting to the officers that he would cooperate fully with their investigation. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the woman he had been secretly sleeping with for the past 2 years. Trent screamed to the entire room that Sylvia was the true mastermind behind every single illicit transaction. He confessed hysterically that she had viciously forced him to embezzle the corporate money to buy the offshore tropical properties. Then, in a desperate, pathetic bid to save his own life and secure a lenient plea deal, he threw her entirely under the bus for the darkest crime of all. He shouted loudly that Sylvia had orchestrated absolutely everything, crying out to the shocked agents that he had only delayed calling the paramedics during my father's fatal heart attack because she had explicitly and maliciously ordered him to let my father die on the office floor. The entire room fell utterly silent as the horrific confession lingered heavily in the cold air, sealing their ultimate destruction. Sylvia's eyes widened in sheer disbelief as the man she had conspired with for years sold her out without a second thought. She thrashed desperately against the agent's unyielding grip, her expensive jewelry digging painfully into her own wrists. Her final agonizing scream was completely drowned out by the harsh metallic clanking of the heavy door locking completely shut behind her as they began to physically drag her away. The absolute annihilation of Sylvia's reign was swift and breathtakingly brutal. The moment the heavy glass boardroom doors locked behind her, the atmosphere inside the Apex Freight headquarters shifted from suffocated panic to stunned silence. Through the transparent walls, I watched the federal agents forcefully march my stepmother toward the private elevators. Her designer burgundy dress, previously a symbol of her unearned aristocratic dominance, now looked entirely absurd as her hands remained securely cuffed behind her back. Trent stumbled closely behind her, flanked by his own escort of federal investigators, his face buried deeply in his hands, as he desperately tried to hide from the shocked staring eyes of the hundreds of employees they had so arrogantly planned to betray. Inside the boardroom, the reality of the $22 million debt call finally registered with Preston and Kendall. Preston's face was completely devoid of its usual arrogant color. He frantically pulled his smartphone from his tailored blazer pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen as he desperately tried to log into his corporate banking applications. I watched his expression crumble in real time as the notifications flashed across his display. His executive platinum cards, the ones he had just used that very morning to place an $80,000 down payment on an imported sports car, were already frozen. Kendall let out a sharp, hysterical sob, staring at her own phone screen. Her exclusive Parisian shopping spree, the one she had boasted about so loudly over our miserable family dinner, had been instantly terminated by the automated fraud detection algorithms triggered by my immediate financial lockdown of the company's operating capital. They were standing in the center of a $15 million logistics empire, entirely penniless and utterly exposed. Lawyer Caldwell, who had spent the last 2 weeks agonizing over my supposed surrender, finally let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at me across the expansive mahogany table, his eyes shining with a profound mixture of shock, immense professional respect, and deep, quiet grief for my late father. He understood exactly what Thomas and I had accomplished together in the dark. I did not linger to watch Preston and Kendall weep over their canceled luxury cars. I smoothly packed the master licensing agreement and the executed debt call back into my leather briefcase. I walked out of the glass boardroom, my pristine white suit completely unwrinkled, leaving the shattered remnants of my step-siblings to figure out their own tragic survival in a harsh reality they were entirely unprepared for. The immediate fallout cascaded violently over the next 72 hours. Sylvia and Trent were officially denied bail by a federal judge who had thoroughly reviewed the extensive, heavily encrypted dossier I provided. The undeniable proof of their offshore money laundering, combined with the horrifying audio transcript proving Trent's deliberate calculated delay in calling emergency medical services for my dying father, elevated their criminal charges to a level that virtually guaranteed decades in federal prison. On the third evening following the raid, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter of my suburban apartment. The caller ID displayed a generic automated number originating from the federal holding facility in downtown Chicago. I accepted the automated charges and pressed the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. Paige, please, you have to listen to me. Sylvia's voice crackled through the receiver, stripped entirely of its polished socialite superiority. She sounded frantic, desperate, and remarkably small. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply waited, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch across the recorded line. "They are freezing everything," Sylvia sobbed, her panic escalating as she realized I was not going to help her narrate her own victimhood. "The offshore accounts, the real estate, everything is gone. Loxley dropped me as a client the second the corporate funds were frozen. You have to drop the civil suit regarding the software licensing debt. Please, Paige. If you drop the $22 million claim, I might be able to afford a decent defense attorney for the criminal trial. We are family, you cannot just leave me in here." She was weaponizing the concept of family, desperately trying to leverage a bond she had spent years actively destroying. She wanted me to surrender the financial chokehold I had expertly engineered so she could buy her way out of a murder conspiracy. I stared out the window of my apartment, my mind flashing back to the pouring rain on the day of my father's funeral. I remembered the cold, aristocratic sneer on her face as she stood dry on the covered porch watching my luggage tumble into the mud. I remembered the vile, racially charged venom she had spat at DeAndre when he tried to demand basic human decency. I brought the phone closer to my mouth, my voice dropping to a chilling, quiet whisper that carried absolutely zero emotional weight. "The house is mine now." I quoted her exact words back to her, perfectly mirroring the cold, dismissive cadence she had used to casually destroy my life. "You can figure it out." I ended the call and permanently blocked the facility's incoming number. I severed the tie forever. There would be no forgiveness, no compromises, and absolutely no mercy. With Sylvia permanently incapacitated and Trent eagerly testifying against her to save his own skin, the path to reclaiming my father's legacy was completely unobstructed. Over the next 3 months, working closely with lawyer Caldwell and my own dedicated team of forensic accountants, I executed the final phase of the master plan. Because Apex Freight was functionally bankrupt and completely unable to pay the massive $22 million licensing debt it owed to Sentinel Logistics Solutions, the logistics company was forced into immediate total liquidation. As the sole proprietor and the primary secured creditor holding the massive debt, I was legally positioned at the absolute front of the line. Through a series of brilliant, perfectly legal corporate acquisitions, I utilized Sentinel Logistics Solutions to systematically absorb all the liquidated physical assets of Apex Freight. I legally acquired the sprawling distribution warehouses, the massive fleet of delivery trucks, and the towering downtown Chicago headquarters for mere pennies on the dollar, paying for them entirely with the massive debt the company already owed me. I did not just steal my father's empire back. I completely legally absorbed it, cleansed it of its parasitic executives, and rebuilt it entirely under my own absolute command. The hundreds of loyal truck drivers, warehouse managers, and administrative staff who had terrifyingly feared for their jobs during the raid were completely retained, their salaries and benefits fully secured under the new, immensely profitable corporate structure I now managed. My first official act as the new Chief Executive Officer of Sentinel Logistics was to restructure the corporate wealth to fiercely protect those who had actually protected me. I sat down with DeAndre in his small home office and handed him a comprehensive, fully funded commercial contract. I legally retained his independent architectural firm as the exclusive design and structural management contractor for all future Sentinel Logistics warehouse expansions across the entire Midwest. The massive, multi-million-dollar retainer fee instantly provided DeAndre with the absolute financial freedom to expand his firm, hire his own dedicated staff, and permanently establish himself as a premier architect in the city, free from the racist, classist judgments of people like my stepmother. My second act was a deeply personal one. I reinstated the premium executive health insurance plan that Sylvia had so maliciously canceled. I personally ensured that Gwen and DeAndre's expensive in vitro fertilization treatments were covered in their entirety without any limitations or deductibles. 6 months after the dramatic boardroom raid, I stood in the bright, sterile waiting room of the fertility clinic, holding DeAndre's hand as the doctor confirmed that Gwen's embryo transfer was a complete and total success. The tears of profound, unfiltered joy that streamed down my sister's face effectively washed away the final lingering shadows of Sylvia's cruelty. 1 year after the rain-soaked eviction that started the war, I stood on the expansive glass-walled balcony of my new penthouse apartment in downtown Chicago. The evening air was crisp and the wind whipped my hair around my face as I looked down at the glittering, sprawling grid of the city below. The heavy, rusted steel safe that had once contained my father's ultimate secret now sat polished and proudly displayed in the corner of my modern home office, a permanent, physical reminder of the brilliant, silent strategist who had loved me enough to trust me with his legacy. Sylvia and Trent were officially serving 30-year sentences in separate federal penitentiaries, their stolen tropical retirement paradise seized and liquidated by the federal government. Preston and Kendall had been forced to move into a cramped shared apartment on the outskirts of the city, working entry-level retail jobs to survive completely cut off from the unearned wealth that had previously defined their entire arrogant existence. I took a slow sip of expensive red wine, letting the complex, bold flavors settle on my tongue. I had walked out of my childhood home with nothing but a broken suitcase and a broken heart. I had quietly surrendered a $15 million fortune without a single fight, allowing my greedy enemies to believe they had completely defeated me. But as I watched the headlights of a Sentinel Logistics delivery truck rumbling smoothly down the distant interstate, operating flawlessly on the proprietary algorithm I now fully controlled, a profound sense of absolute peace settled over my soul. I had learned the ultimate lesson of the corporate battlefield. Sometimes giving up everything is just the very first step in taking it all back.